Imagine walking into a laboratory with just a tiny drop of blood. No large vial, no endless needles, no complicated process. Just a few drops, and supposedly hundreds of medical tests. That was the promise behind Theranos. And at the center of it was a 19-year-old Stanford dropout named Elizabeth Holmes, who believed she could revolutionize the way the world tested blood. Investors believed her too. They gave her hundreds of millions of dollars. Her company eventually reached a valuation of nearly $9 billion. But there was a problem. The technology wasn't doing what the world had been led to believe. And when people finally began asking what was happening behind the laboratory doors, the entire empire started to crack. Because when you tell a 19-year-old that she can't change an industry, sometimes she doesn't walk away. Sometimes she becomes determined to prove everyone wrong. And Elizabeth Holmes was determined to prove them wrong. Elizabeth Holmes wasn't born into Silicon Valley royalty. She was a young woman with an enormous ambition. While studying at Stanford University, she became fascinated by the idea of making medical testing faster, cheaper, and less painful. The traditional process was familiar. A needle, a vial of blood, a laboratory, then waiting for the results. Holmes imagined something completely different. What if doctors could get hundreds of tests from only a tiny amount of blood? What if testing could become quicker and easier? And what if one company could completely change the way people understood their health? At just 19 years old, Holmes left Stanford and founded a company that would eventually become Theranos. She wasn't simply selling a laboratory service. She was selling a vision of the future. And the bigger that vision became, the more powerful Elizabeth Holmes became with it. But visions need money, and Theranos was about to get a lot of it. Theranos attracted investors who believed Holmes was building something extraordinary. Millions of dollars began flowing into the company, then tens of millions, eventually hundreds of millions. And as the company grew, so did its valuation. At its peak, Theranos was valued at nearly $9 billion. Holmes herself became extraordinarily wealthy on paper. But there was something unusual about this fortune. The company wasn't worth billions because it was producing billions in profits. Its value was largely based on what investors believed the technology could become. And that distinction matters, because investors weren't simply buying what Theranos was doing. They were buying what Theranos promised it would do. The promise was enormous. A few drops of blood could supposedly replace the traditional laboratory process. But there was one question hiding underneath all those billions. Could the machine actually do it? Theranos called its blood testing system Edison. The idea sounded almost futuristic. Instead of drawing large amounts of blood from a patient's vein, Theranos wanted to collect a much smaller sample, often using a finger prick. That tiny sample could then be processed for medical testing. The potential was enormous. Less blood, less pain, faster testing, lower costs. And if it worked at scale, it could completely disrupt the traditional laboratory industry. But there was a problem. The technology was not capable of performing everything Theranos claimed. And behind the scenes, conventional laboratory machines were being used for many tests. That created a dangerous gap between the story being presented to the public and what was actually happening inside the laboratory. The company was promising the future, but the technology was struggling to deliver the present, and some people inside Theranos began to notice. The first cracks didn't appear in a newspaper. They appeared inside the company. Scientists and employees raised concerns about the technology and the accuracy of testing. Some employees questioned whether Theranos' machines could perform the enormous range of tests being promised. Others became uncomfortable with what they were seeing. And this created a problem for Theranos, because the company had built its identity around secrecy. The technology was described as revolutionary, but very few people were allowed to see exactly how it worked. The fewer people who knew what was happening, the easier it was to protect the story. But secrecy can work both ways. It can protect a company from competitors, or it can hide problems from everyone else. And at Theranos, those problems were becoming harder to contain. The most important question now becomes, if the technology wasn't working as advertised, how could Theranos continue operating? The answer was not one simple trick. It was a system of secrecy, selective information, and misleading representations. The company continued presenting itself as though its technology could perform the revolutionary testing it promised. But behind the scenes, conventional machines were being used for many tests. The result was a dangerous contradiction. The public saw a futuristic machine. Investors saw revolutionary technology. Patients saw a convenient new way to get medical tests. But inside the laboratory, the reality was much more complicated. And because Theranos tightly controlled information, it became difficult for outsiders to see the difference. The company wasn't simply selling a machine. It was selling confidence in the machine. And that confidence became extremely valuable. Because the more people believed, the more money came in. And the more money came in, the harder it became to admit the technology wasn't what everyone had been promised. This is where the story became much bigger than Elizabeth Holmes. Theranos attracted wealthy investors, powerful board members, major business partners, and enormous public attention. The company began working with Walgreens. Patients could walk into certain Walgreens locations and have blood tests performed through the Theranos system. Now the technology wasn't just sitting inside a laboratory. It was entering people's lives. The stakes had changed. If Theranos failed, this wasn't simply a startup losing money. Patients could be affected. Investors could lose fortunes. Business partners could suffer enormous damage. And the bigger Theranos became, the more difficult it was to stop. Because now there was too much at stake. Too much money. Too much reputation. Too much belief. And then a journalist started asking questions. His name was John Carreyrou. He was an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, and something about Theranos didn't make sense to him. The claims were extraordinary. The technology supposedly required only tiny amounts of blood. The company claimed its system could perform a huge range of tests, yet much of the technology remained hidden from outsiders. Carreyrou began digging. He started contacting people who had worked inside Theranos. He asked questions. He compared accounts. He looked for evidence. And gradually, he began hearing things that didn't match the public story. Former employees described serious problems with the technology. Some described conventional laboratory equipment being used behind the scenes. Others described concerns about the accuracy of the company's testing. But Carreyrou couldn't simply publish a story because someone told him something. He needed evidence. And that's when the investigation became a puzzle. Carreyrou didn't discover the Theranos scandal in one dramatic moment. He assembled it. One former employee gave him one piece. Another gave him something else. Documents helped confirm what people were telling him. Technical claims were compared against what employees said was actually happening inside the laboratory. And gradually, the pieces began fitting together. The company had promised a revolution, but the technology wasn't performing as advertised. People inside the company knew it, and the public didn't. Carreyrou now had a story, but publishing it would mean challenging one of Silicon Valley's most powerful startups. And Theranos wasn't going to simply watch him do it, because once the story became public, the walls around Theranos would begin coming down. Theranos didn't disappear in one day. It collapsed piece by piece. First came the reporting, then the investigations, then regulatory action. Business relationships began falling apart. Testing operations were restricted and eventually shut down. Lawsuits followed. The company that had once been valued at billions was running out of ways to defend itself. Elizabeth Holmes had built Theranos around one extraordinary promise. But once that promise was publicly challenged, everything connected to it began to unravel. The technology, the partnerships, the valuation, the reputation, and eventually, the company itself. The billion-dollar dream was over, but the consequences were only beginning. The final chapter moved from the laboratory to the courtroom. Elizabeth Holmes was charged with federal fraud offenses. After a highly publicized trial, she was convicted on 4 counts relating to defrauding investors. She was eventually sentenced to 135 months in federal prison. Ramesh Sunny Balwani, her former business partner and Theranos executive, was prosecuted separately. He was also convicted of federal fraud offenses and sentenced to 155 months in prison. The company itself had already collapsed. The billionaire dream was gone. What remained was a legal record of how the promises, money, and deception had eventually collided. But a courtroom can determine guilt. It can't completely explain why so many intelligent and powerful people believed the story for so long. And that's where the real lesson begins. Theranos was supposed to be the future, and that's exactly what made the story so powerful. People didn't just invest in a company. They invested in an idea, a future where blood testing would become faster, easier, and cheaper. Elizabeth Holmes became the face of that future. And once people wanted that future badly enough, they became more willing to believe it had already arrived. That's where greed becomes dangerous. Not only the greed of the person selling the dream, but the greed of everyone desperate to own a piece of it. Investors wanted the next revolutionary company. Customers wanted revolutionary healthcare. The media wanted the next great entrepreneur. And Theranos gave everyone a story they wanted to believe, until reality arrived. Because in the end, the most expensive thing about Theranos wasn't the technology. It was believing the promise before proving it. And sometimes, the most dangerous financial illusion isn't a story that sounds impossible. It's a story that sounds exactly like the future you desperately want to be true.